If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, that's probably going to happen a lot. Please turn in it to Acts chapter 21. This is where we'll spend our time today. In any given service, and this is the difficulty with doing this, and I'm not saying this to say, oh, it's so hard for me, because it's not, but this is the difficulty. I'm looking in this room and I'm seeing, Toby and Jesse and Al, Ed, Brad, Lauren, KG, my wife, Nancy, all of us in this room, Colin, Janelle, Lottie and Winston. We are, every one of us, going through things that are going to seem distant to the things that happen in the church. That's just the way it is. I wish that, that God would do the kind of miracle in the service such that each heart is absolutely filled in the places where each heart is empty by what we do in the service. That it was tailor-made for each person and their needs. I wish that would be the case, but it's not. So it's just like I remember reading of a person who was in the preaching work, and you do a sermon on money, or you do a sermon on whatever it is, and you've got somebody in the congregation who's suffering with just the opposite. You do a sermon on what it is to live the good life, and you've got somebody out there who's lost their job. You do a sermon on what it is to give, and you've got somebody out there who's been unemployed for a long time and they can't give. Or you do something with regard to how good God is, and somebody's home is broken. How do you speak to all of that? There's no way that you can do that. So I say that not to disclaim the sermon. I say it because I want you all to know that that sensitivity is within this room. God knows what each person in this room is facing. He knows what each of you are thinking. He knows what you're going through. He knows what's important to you in this moment. And He knows that some of the things that we are doing in here are going to seem distant to where you are. He knows that. But He's able to take the bits and pieces of what we do and to touch hearts. So let's just, as best we can, be open to that as we look in the Scripture today. Paul is leaving Asia, and he's going to encounter just what we're talking about today in his own life. What is God saying to me? How does He determine that? So let's look at the text. I'll begin reading in verse 1. As we, that is Luke, Paul, and all the rest, had torn ourselves away from those who had gathered on the beach, we put out to sea and sailed to Kos. The next day we were in Rhodes. From there we went to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia and went on board to set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of Cyprus, we sailed on to Syria, and we landed at Tyre, where our ship was to unload its cargo. Finding the disciples there, we stayed with them for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. But when our time was up, we left and continued on our way. All of the disciples, their wives and children, accompanied us out of the city. And there on the beach, we knelt to pray. And after saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship. And all of those who'd gathered returned home. Paul's in a hurry. He's trying to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. He's already missed Passover, but you got that 50-day gap between Passover and Pentecost, and so he's trying to get back. And so they're in this sailing situation where they stop at these little ports, bumping along the coast. If you get a map, you can see where Paul went. And he arrives at Patara, and he seeks out some believers there and finds them. He gets into the boat at Patara and has a 400-mile nonstop journey across the sea to Tyre as he's headed for the mainland where Jerusalem is. And Tyre's a little island right off the mainland, about a mile off the coast. They have a week-long layover because back then it wasn't like it is today. You'd take one of these giant container ships and go into the port at Brunswick, and they can hook all those cranes to those containers and have that whole thing unloaded in a day and loaded back up, and it's off the next day to set sail. Well, back then everybody's carrying this stuff off by hand and by the animals, and so it takes a long time to unload a boat. It takes a long time to put everything back. So they've got this week, and Paul goes into Tyre and wants to find some believers, and guess what? There are believers there. I remember when I traveled, I became a believer in May of '82. And I joined a band and started traveling in August, the 1st of August of the same year. So I'd only been a Christian for a couple of months. And everything that was happening when I traveled was new to me. And I will never forget it. We went to Michigan to this festival. There were about 30,000 people. We were to play. A bunch of other bands were there to play. And we met people that the people in the band kind of knew. I didn't know them from James O. High Pocket and Sally anybody. I didn't know who they were. And I was a brand new believer. And instantly, I had a bond with these people that I was just meeting out of nowhere. And I remember, I probably sounded stupid to the rest of the band. I said, guys, isn't it incredible that these people we don't even know, that there's this bond between us? And they're going, yeah, we all know about that, Rip. We've been Christians for a long time, you know. For them, it was just the way it is. But for me, it was brand new. I was reading this article once, years ago. And there was this pastor who went from the United States to Moscow when it was still part of the Soviet Union, when Russia was part of that. The Iron Curtain had not fallen. And he was on the street. It was cold. There weren't many people out moving around. But he was on the street, and there was this man doing some window cleaning or whatever he was doing on a building. And the pastor that was in Russia heard a hymn that he recognized. And so he walked across the street to this Russian guy. They don't know each other. They've never met. He's never been to Russia in his life. He hears the hymn. He taps the man on the shoulder. The man turns around like, what? And he whistles the hymn back to the Russian man. The Russian man smiles, points to the sky, and they embrace. There's that instant bond when you've got the Spirit of God living in you. There's something there. I experienced it traveling for 18 years, and I never got used to it. It was always a shock to me to have these friendships with people that I'd never met. Well, Paul gets this. And what is shocking here is Paul is getting information from these people where the Spirit of God is living in them, these believers, and everywhere he goes, he's been traveling now for about a decade. He was in Ephesus for 3 years, and everywhere he goes, they all say the same thing. Do not go to Jerusalem, because in Jerusalem it's going to be troublesome. You're going to have trouble in Jerusalem. Don't go. I mean, they're on the beach weeping in Ephesus to let Paul go. He's going to Jerusalem. Don't go to Jerusalem. The Spirit of God is speaking to these people. And the message is the same for Paul everywhere he goes. Don't go to Jerusalem. Now, stop and think what it would be like if you were getting a message like that all the time. One message over and over and over and over again. And the text says as much in Acts chapter 20, that in every city Paul was warned about going to Jerusalem. Man, let's continue with this text, however, in verse 7. We continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we greeted the believers there and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who were also prophets. After we had been there for a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said, "The Holy Spirit says to you, in this way the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and hand him to the Gentiles." When we heard this, Luke is saying this now, we and all of the people there gathered with Paul, we pleaded with him not to go to Jerusalem. And Paul answered, said, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I'm ready not only to be bound, but to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When Paul would not be discouraged from it, we gave up, and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we got ready and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manason, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. And when we arrived at Jerusalem, everyone there greeted us warmly. Okay, you've got so much history here. The history's tied into Philip. I don't know if you remember Acts chapter 6 through Acts chapter 9, where you have the stoning of Stephen, the choosing of the deacons, the disciples, Peter and the other apostles can't keep track of all of the needs that the growing church has. There are just too many needs. Well, the Greek-speaking, believing widows were not being seen to with the same quality of care that the Jewish widows were being seen to. And the disciples are saying, we're not trying to neglect anybody, we just can't keep it all up. So they say, let's choose 7 guys here. And of course, this is a patriarchal society, so it's always men. They choose them to be those who would do this work, this ministry work of taking the distribution of food and money to these widows, because that's the only means they have for care for themselves. They choose 7. Philip's one of them. He was one of the ones chosen with Stephen, who was stoned to death, and Philip was there when Stephen was stoned to death. Well, here's Paul. Paul's the one holding everybody's coats while they stoned Stephen to death. Philip saw that. Again, just how incredibly amazing it is once the Spirit of God lives in us as to what He can do to heal us of these kinds of things. Philip accepts Paul as one of his own now. Philip saw Paul standing there giving approval to the stoning of Stephen. That's pretty remarkable. And then you see in Luke, he says we, which means that Luke is writing this and narrating this as one of the gatherings, says, we tried to tell Paul, listen to all of these messages you've heard now for nearly 10 years. Do not go to Jerusalem. Bad things are waiting for you in Jerusalem. The Spirit of God is urging Paul to go to Jerusalem. The Spirit of God, it says, through these people is saying Jerusalem's going to be bad for you. And then you got this guy like an Old Testament prophet. He's just like Ezekiel. If you go back and read Ezekiel, Ezekiel did physical things to illustrate, like he put the frying pan in front of his head, he put the hole in his wall, he did all kinds of strange, shaved his head, did all kinds of strange things to demonstrate to the Jews what was coming. Well, Agabus does the same thing, takes Paul's belt off and ties his own hands and feet and says the owner of this belt is going to be bound when he goes to Jerusalem. How much more information does Paul have to have here to realize Jerusalem's going to be bad? And it says that the Spirit of God is giving the warnings out. And Luke says, we just gave up. We're trying to keep Paul from going to Jerusalem, but we just finally gave up and said the Lord's will be done. Here's the confusing yes, sir.
What's drawing?
I'm sorry?
What's drawing Paul to Jerusalem?
We're getting to it. That's a very good question. That's a good question. Spirit of God wants, Paul feels the Spirit of God urging him to go to Jerusalem. Agabus the prophet says, don't go. All of his friends say, don't go. All of the people for 10 years have been saying, don't go. I'm going to say, here's the confusing point. What is God's will? You know, we're all sitting in here today, and I guarantee you, every person in this room would love to know God's will for their life. I would, right? Everybody would. How do you hear it and how do you know? Paul's acid test for his friends, the acid test for Paul to hear God's will is, you got to be safe, Paul. We see all this trouble coming for you. Don't go, don't go, don't go. The message is always the same. Paul feels like he's got to go. How does Paul hear God's will here? How do the people hear God's will here? I remember, and you, some of you in here could probably resonate with this. I remember when I was probably late middle school, 13, 14 years old, and I was in church and I hated being there. My parents drugged me there. You know that story, some of you. And we had a girl who was in graduating high school. And I remember her face. I cannot remember her name. I want to say it was Peggy, but I'm not certain. Doesn't matter. We'll call her Peggy. Peggy came to the church. The pastor brought her up front in the service and said, Peggy is announcing that she wants to be a missionary to Africa, to Chad, as I recollect. Very dangerous place to go. And I remember sitting there thinking to myself, it was all the ammunition I needed to say, I don't want to become a Christian. Look at what God might do with me. He might send me to Chad. I don't want to go to Chad. I don't want to be like this person. That didn't sound good to me at all. There's a place in every one of us in this room where when God enters our hearts and calls us out, the first reaction we have is, and you've heard this, I've heard this, the first reaction we have is, God is going to make me happy. He's going to make me happy. He's not going to make us happy. I'll tell you what he will do, though. I guarantee you that woman, Peggy, who went to Chad, she did go. There is no place on this earth that she would have rather been than in Chad. And to me, it sounded like purgatory. As a non-believer, 14 years old, not even wanting to be where I was, watching the pastor bring this girl up and say she wants to go to Chad. But I guarantee you, wild horses strapped to her could not have stopped her, because she was being urged to go to Chad by God himself. And she went. If you and I have a calling in life, and God really is the one doing the calling, there is nothing that you and I can do in life that's going to be more fulfilling than that thing. Whatever it is. I look at somebody, and I don't want to pick on you, KG, but you're sitting there, so I can, and there's nothing you can do about it. KG is a lifetime firefighter, emergency responder. I would say you probably would answer if anybody asked you, I'm called to that. Yeah. There are people who are called to run the cash register at Walmart. There are people called to that. If we didn't have them, who would do it? So there's a place in which God takes every life and He gives us something, something that we are to do. And there is nothing in life that's going to fulfill us like that thing or those things. Nothing. Pick whatever it is. Make tons of money. I'd like to do that. But do all these things. None of them are going to fulfill. They might make us happy, though. There's a big gap between fulfilled and happy. A big gap. Paul was being driven by the Spirit of God. These are not universals. We can't take a life and make it a formula. That's what some people try to do. They take a life, somebody in the Bible, and they say, well, if I'll just do these 4 things that this person did, it'll turn out like that for me. No. God is working in you. He's working in me. He's working in us and through us to take us where He intends for us to go and do and be. I remember reading, and by the way, just to show you it's not a universal, sometimes God does make the person happy. I mean, if you think about it, it makes some sense, doesn't it? Let's say Al, okay? You're sitting there, and I can pick on you because you can't do anything about it. You're just sitting there. Let's say that God comes to Al, and next week Al shows up, and Al is a billionaire. That'd be pretty good, wouldn't it? Yeah, it would be good. That's a pretty mild reaction. It would be great. It'd be great to be a billionaire. But and he might do that. And I would look at it, you would look at it, and we would say to ourselves, what a testimony that God made Al happy like that. There was a guy in Pennsylvania that I worked with. This guy, I am convinced, was on the earth to make money, and he made lots of it. He gave a lot of money away. But he was really, really good at what he did, which was making money. He was just an incredible entrepreneurial business person. But my business partner and myself, who were not quite so entrepreneurially spectacular, worked in his house to make repairs on his home. And his wife would cook muffins every day when we worked in there and give us muffins at 10 o'clock when we took a break. This was back when I used to do that. And we would sit down, and one day she would sit down and talk. Some of the days she would talk with us, and she would say to us how difficult it was for her in her home because her husband was always gone. God made him successful. He made lots of money for their family, very successful, but he was gone a lot. There was a price to be paid. You see, sometimes the will of God being done, it's not always a perfectly rosy picture, even though for him it was great. I remember hearing him talk to me about how he stayed at the office until 2 a.m. Now you got to realize, this is a multimillionaire. In his office at 2 o'clock in the morning with a hot glue gun fixing a $50 vacuum cleaner. Come on, man. You can probably buy the store that sells the vacuum cleaners. Just go get another one. He's in there. This is just who he was. God had built him to make money. Sometimes God makes us happy, but sometimes He puts us in places that from the outside look like a waste. Remember, how many of you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire? You've seen it? If I had my guitar here, I'd play that music, or if I could figure it out on a keyboard, you'd know right away the movie. Eric Liddell, the Olympian, ran in the 1927 Olympics. Ireland and England sent runners over, and Eric Liddell was slated to win the 100-meter because Eric Liddell was the fastest human being on the planet. I mean, he had beaten everybody in every country where he'd run. Eric Liddell was a Christian, and his goal was to do this Olympics, however it turned out, and then after that he was on his way to China as a missionary. Eric came to the 100-meter, which was his event, and they held it on a Sunday. And Eric said, I won't run on Sunday. I mean, this is the guy that's going to win the gold for that country. No, not going to do it. It's on a Sunday. Now, I got to say, for me, I would have run it. But I'm not Eric Liddell, and I'm not in that spot. And he felt compelled to not run the 100 on Sunday. And sure enough, he didn't. And the next person in line won it, Harold Abrams. Eric Liddell then the next day on Monday ran the 400-meter, which was not his race, and set a world record. Eric Liddell then, immediately after the Olympics, loaded up with his sister Jenny to go to China. And there was a point in the movie where Jenny comes to him and says, Eric, God made you for a purpose. What are you doing with all this running? You're spending all your time running. And Eric Liddell took Jenny by the shoulders in the movie and said, Jenny, God made me for a purpose, for China. God made me fast, and I feel His pleasure when I run. There's a place wherein the calling of God does not look from the outside to what we would expect it to look like. To Paul's companions, Luke and everybody, Paul's calling did not look like what they expected. Paul was going to go to Jerusalem. And everything that Agabus said would happen to him, happened to him. But there's no place on the planet that Paul would have rather been than to go to Jerusalem, because he felt called to be there. Oswald Chambers says it well. And by the way, people have come to me throughout my life when I was traveling, and even here in this setting. Rip, what do you think God's will is for my life? I don't know. I barely know what it is for my own, much less yours. Oswald Chambers says it well, though. He says this, and listen very carefully to this. This sums this up far more beautifully than I ever could. He says, notice God's unutterable waste of believers according to the judgment of those who don't believe. He just wastes them. I mean, you got Paul with all that intellect, all that training, writer of the New Testament. Why would God allow him then to be arrested and sent to Rome through Jerusalem? Why? It just looks like a waste. We need Paul. These churches need Paul. Luke needs Paul. Oswald Chambers goes on and says, God plants His own in the most useless of places. We say God intends me to be here because I am so useful. Jesus never estimated His life along its greatest use. God puts His believers where they will glorify Him, and we are not judges of where that is. And when we're there, we're going to find maybe not happiness, but I promise you we will find contentment, fulfillment, and peace when we're in the center of His will. I promise we will. I don't know where everybody is.